8 minutes after 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. So I want to tell you a story that indicates how stupid I am. I'm stupid sometimes, Robin. I've had my share of stupid stuff.
Gosh.
When I grew up in New York, and when I first moved here to Ocala, the air here was so much cleaner than in New York. But you don't notice it right away, you know? You don't even think about it. You just, especially because I was a kid. So I remember the first time I was in one of Florida's bigger cities, and I was behind a bus, and I could smell those diesel fumes, and I was like, "Oh man, it's great! It smells like New York. I feel like I'm home again." Mm-hmm. Right? How stupid was that, Robin? To actually enjoy the smell of diesel fumes, huh? Wasn't that stupid? I do the same thing with cigarettes. I don't smoke.
Yeah.
But I took accordion lessons when I was a kid, and my teacher smoked. Mm-hmm. You know, so there's times sometimes I'll smell a cigarette, like in the distance, the secondhand smoke, as they call it. You know, it's bad for you, right? But every once in a while, I'll go, "Oh, that smells so good." It smells right.
It's a good memory, though. It's different than actually doing it. It's a good memory.
I guess the point I'm trying to make, in order to introduce our next guest, is that some of the stuff that we have almost like allowed to be part of our lives, whether it's herbicides or fluoride in the water or whatever. We got to take a second look at some of these things. So let's talk to Dr. Leonardo Trasande. He's on the phone. His book is called Sicker, Fatter, Poorer. I found it on Amazon, and that's why I have the cover on the streaming video if you're watching it on that. Dr. Trasande is a leader in children's environmental health. He's a tenured associate professor in pediatrics, environmental medicine, and population health at New York University. He's a contributor to everything, Robin. The New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, Reuters. We use all these agencies for our news. And again, his book is called Sicker, Fatter, Poorer. Dr. Leonardo Trasande, good morning, sir.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Are you in New York right now?
I am.
See, when you move away, you're going to miss the smell of fumes. I know it's weird, but you will.
There you go. We've made a lot of progress here in New York too, but I understand where you're coming from.
Do you know? We all remember, if we're old enough, when we were told to change the paint because of the lead in the paint, and I remember people saying, "Oh, come on! I grew up with that. It's not harmful," but it was harmful, wasn't it? Obviously,
we still get a $200 billion economic stimulus in the United States as a result of doing the right thing and getting lead out of gasoline. I tell the undergraduates I teach at NYU that they're literally 4 to 7 IQ points smarter than I am because they got lead out of gasoline in time for them to be born.
Is that right? Well, see, now that's an interesting statistic that we wouldn't have known. So a lot of the problems that happen to us when we're very, very young, I would think.
That's true. And so let's jump in about what this book is about, which are about hormones, which are signaling molecules in our body. Chemicals that disrupt those signals or scramble them contribute to disease, and we call them endocrine disrupting chemicals. And we used to think that endocrine disruption only occurred at very high levels of exposure or in rare, really so-called bad chemicals. But the reality is now we know over 1,000 chemicals are potentially endocrine disruptors. And in particular, the evidence is strongest for 4 categories of chemicals. We're talking about flame retardants, chemicals used in electronics, carpeting, and furniture, pesticides, which are used in agriculture, bisphenols, which are used in aluminum can linings and thermal paper receipts, and phthalates, which are used in cosmetics, personal care products, and even food packaging.
Oh, my gosh. So are there, or for lack of a way to ask this question, I might be saying the wrong word, but are there organic versions of all those things?
Well, there are safe and simple steps we all can take to limit these exposures. Right away, you're jumping on one of them, which is organic food. And here's the good news. Everyone thinks that organic food is too expensive, and I don't disagree there regarding a price margin, but that price margin is narrowing as the market share for organic grows, and you're seeing it even in big box stores these days. One of the other hidden secrets is that there are priority fruits and vegetables, the leafy greens and vegetables where literally you eat the outer layer where the pesticide gets sprayed onto it more directly. Environmental Working Group has a good guide called The Dirty Dozen that gives you some safe and simple priority steps that you can take to limit your exposure to these pesticides in foods.
Well, that's a good idea. Just take a few layers off, and you'll be safer.
Well, the problem is that for spinach and lettuce and things like that, that's a more difficult job. And so the better move there is to buy organic for those foods in particular.
When manufacturers are putting together canned items or items in bottles like baby food and juices, how do we know that they're all truly safe?
Well, this is one of the challenges. So canned foods are the greatest source of BPA and other bisphenols. And you've probably heard in the news a lot of attention to BPA-free cans and things like that. The challenge now is that largely they've replaced BPA with one of 40 other bisphenols. And what little we know about one bisphenol is bisphenol S, is that it's as estrogenic, as toxic to embryos, and even more persistent in the environment. So my advice is to avoid canned foods across the board, simply because you can't really confirm at the present time whether it's free of these bisphenols.
And now, are they labeled in such a way that will make it easier for us as consumers? Not just the foods, but I mean like the cosmetics and the other things that we might be using that expose us to the harmful chemicals?
So you're raising a great question. So you don't need a PhD in chemistry to figure out what to pick and choose when you're shopping. In general, for cosmetics and lotions, the two key words on the ingredient label to look out for are phthalates. If you're looking for a way to remember that, PHTH, anything with PHTH is something to watch out for. And also there's this broad category called fragrance, which ends up being a catch-all for trade secrets in the industry. And sometimes these chemicals that are in those fragrances aren't a problem, but in other cases they may well be a problem. And until we get better transparency from the fragrance industry, I suggest avoiding those materials altogether.
Is there a part of this conversation that should deal with legislation? Should we, as Americans or as people of the world, wherever each one of our own countries, I guess, should we be demanding that our governments regulate these things, or is that? I guess this is almost a philosophical question, but I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So there's a role for regulation, but even in this tough political climate, there's so much that we can do with the power of our proverbial wallets and pocketbooks. If you look at the BPA-free movement that, by the way, led to the ban by FDA of BPA in baby bottles and sippy cups, that really came as a byproduct of consumer and media attention to the issue. And even more recently, you've seen two major supermarket chains get those Teflon-like chemicals, which mess with thyroid hormone, out of the buffet-style food packaging. And that was based on a study of 5 samples done by an outside laboratory. So it speaks to how a relatively small amount of data can drive the change that we're all seeking. And again, it speaks to the multiplying power. So if a supermarket chain goes to a manufacturer and says, get this out of my material, that has a domino effect, because those supermarkets have a pretty big market share. And if you think people listen to the pocketbooks and wallets in corporations, you know they're listening to the major suppliers or purchasers at supermarkets and such.
So as a pediatrician, what do you tell young parents when you see their brand new babies for the first time?
I tell them that there's a lot that they can do now to limit the exposures of concern. So we've talked about eating organic. We've talked about avoiding canned foods. In addition to the cosmetics and lotions we talked about, there's certain things to watch out for with regard to food and plastics. So you've seen the labels that say microwave safe. Well, that's misleading in the sense that that's only helping you understand which plastics won't warp or bend in the microwave at a gross, large-scale, visible level. At a microscopic level, even those plastics can break down and leach into the food in the first place, contaminating the food as a result. In addition, avoid machine dishwashing plastic containers, and there's always glass.
The sicker part of the title, sicker, fatter, poorer, is easier to understand than the fatter part. I want you to address that, and that's harder to understand than the poorer part. I'm trying to make sense out of how a hormonal disrupting chemical might cause us to be less. To be poorer, as the title says. Can I just focus for a second on the fatter? I have something I want to share with you. I have in my family. There was a child was adopted, and the child, when he was adopted, maybe he was 10. He wasn't a baby, and he was chubby. After joining the family, to his parents' credit, he is no longer heavy. He's no longer chubby, and I know that they didn't put him on a diet. They just eat right, and so there's a testament, almost exactly what you're saying, to doing something right to correct the problem. Sounds like to me, anyway. Am I on the right track?
Well, the reality here is we're understanding so much extremely quickly, especially over the past couple decades, with what chemicals do to body mass. We now know of a whole host, at least 50 chemicals that are obesogens, or chemicals that literally can make you fatter. And that's where the science is new, and that's why it's not on the radar as much as you would think. So we already talked about BPA. BPA is a prototype obesogen. It makes fat cells bigger. It disrupts the function of a protein that protects the heart called adiponectin. And it also is a synthetic estrogen. And synthetic estrogens are important because they can have sex-specific effects on body mass. Now, we have a long way to go to understand whether the child in the scenario you're describing might have gotten literally fatter as a result of chemical exposure. But let me make one point really clear. Nothing I'm saying undermines the importance of diet and physical activity as the major drivers of the obesity and diabetes epidemic. But it's harder to change diet and physical activity than it is to change manufacturing processes when chemicals are increasingly being understood to be the third and equally major driver of the epidemic.
The book again is called Sicker, Fatter, Poorer. Our guest is Leonardo Trasande. Doctor, am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Trasande, you got it.
Okay.
Does your book also bring warnings to men because maybe they're trying to have children and it might not be the woman's fault, but it's the man's fault because of the low sperm count?
Yes, but here's some news. I don't just think men who are trying to have a family are the only ones who should be concerned. But let's start with the men who are trying to have a family. So studies have documented that the phthalates I talked about, which mess with the male sex hormone, by the way, and we'll come back to that for the men who aren't trying to have a family. But the phthalates have been associated in men trying to conceive as a couple with delays in time to pregnancy. And we know that the later it takes to have a baby, the greater the likelihood is of needing in vitro fertilization and other assisted reproductive techniques. Now, this is going to make the guys who aren't even thinking about having a family uncomfortable, but you've probably seen the data that 40% of men over the age of 40 have some degree of impotence. And testosterone, as we talked about, is an important hormone for male libido as well. And even mostly in worker studies, larger scale exposure studies, but they found exposures to bisphenol A and metals associated with impotence among exposed men.
Oh, that's interesting.
I wanted to ask you about the diet drinks. Are the chemicals in diet drinks actually contributing to obesity?
That's an area where we still got a ways to go in the research. And that's why this book focuses really on the best science and what we know and what people can do to eliminate or reduce the exposures for which the science is strongest.
And is heart disease one of the problems that we should be aware of?
I'm going to continue along that line of this notion of low T and say that while low T might either be a marker or a predictor of heart disease in men, the fact that phthalates and other chemicals mess with the male sex hormone is not just a lifestyle matter, but potentially literally a life or death matter. And studies have associated low T with early death among men, and we know that phthalates are also associated with decreases in testosterone among exposed men. So you can actually connect the dots all the way.
Wow. The book is currently #1 in the pharmacology, toxicology category on Amazon. It's called Sicker, Fatter, Poorer. And doctor, this is a live show. That means our listeners quite often call in, and when you've got the phone ringing, do you want to take some calls?
Sure.
All right. Let me say hello to one of our callers. Good morning. You're first. You're on the air. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Good morning. All of this brouhaha over recreational marijuana, one of the things that's overlooked by the advocates is that it causes testosterone changes in men.
Doctor?
That's the...
Doctor, you want to comment?
Well, we've got a ways to go, and I think we don't want to get distracted from the broader reality that folks who aren't using marijuana are being affected. These are chemicals that are affecting all of us in our environment. These are chemicals you can detect in 95% or more of the U.S. population. And the effects are not just trivial at a health level, but at an economic level. These are effects on the human body that cost America $340 billion. That's billion with a B each year.
Wow.
That's 2.3% of our gross domestic product.
Plus, I would think that, and I'm not, obviously you're the expert, I'm thinking that marijuana that is prescribed is probably going to do some good for whatever it's prescribed for, even if it does have some elements that might not be the best. But it's kind of like all medicines. You kind of weigh what the pros and cons are. Let me squeeze another phone call in. Good morning. You're on the air. Thank you for calling. You're on the air with Dr. Trasande.
Yes, thank you, Doctor. My wife and I are big popcorn lovers, and we recently, because of the convenience, have gone to microwave popcorn in paper bags. Is that bad?
I would avoid it because increasingly we found the perfluoroalkyl compounds or the Teflon-like compounds in those linings, and they get in ultimately into the popcorn. And these perfluoroalkyl compounds don't just mess with thyroid hormone. They've been associated in some studies of women with regain of weight that they've lost after a healthy diet and physical activity intervention. So it's not just effects on the brain or thyroid hormone. It can actually affect metabolism as well.
Wow. Do the plastic bottles that we drink our water out of, or are they leaching into the water?
Here's the good news. The recycling numbers are your best guide in this regard. Avoiding the numbers 3, 6, and 7 are the greatest way to avoid the chemicals of concern. 3 are for phthalates, 6 is for styrene, which is a known carcinogen, and 7 includes those bisphenols. There's some plant-based plastics out there that use the 7 label, so unfortunately they're mixed in with the bisphenol-laden ones as well.
Will we be able to, I know your book is really amazing, but would we be able to get a copy of your study, the Children's Health and Environment Study?
We're actually still working through the early phases of that study, but we're already publishing and writing up some early findings from that study, and we'd be happy to provide information and data as we go. And there are plenty of more studies that we've done that we'd be happy to share. A lot of this information, by the way, is available at my website, which is leotrasande, TRASANDE.com.
Very good. Is it region specific? Like, would the Southeast have different chemicals to be concerned about than the Northwest, or would America have different chemicals than Europe, et cetera, or is it pretty much across the globe?
The most striking differences are between America and Europe based on what we found so far. And the reality is that policy predicts exposure, exposure contributes to disease, and disease costs us all. What in particular was the biggest difference between the U.S. and Europe were the brominated flame retardants. Back in the 70s, during the tobacco era, California required a stricter flammability standard, thinking that it would save lives. And that flammability standard required the use of flame retardant additives in furniture. Unfortunately, that didn't really slow the spread of fires enough to save lives, and it did disrupt the function of thyroid hormone, which is crucial for brain development in young kids. And so we've literally had a generation of Americans who've had higher levels of these flame retardants, such that they're in the extreme end of the distribution in Europe. And that's ultimately cost the United States $282 billion a year of that $340 billion number I mentioned earlier.
Can you talk real quickly about internal organs? If we were to, for example, only eat organic produce, would our livers be thanking us, and would our other organs, especially the filtering organs, would we be benefiting them?
Here's the great news. There are short, medium, and long-term benefits of these proactive preventions. So, for example, reducing canned food consumption can reduce your bisphenol A level or bisphenol level in a day or two. Then you might start seeing hormonal changes in a week or two. And then later on, you might see benefits in the form of reductions in chronic disease over the next years that follow. So there are short, medium, and long-term benefits to doing the right thing here.
Well, in the course of a radio interview, you got a lot of information out there, but obviously the most information is going to be available in the book. It is currently #1. It's called Sicker, Fatter, Poorer. Look it up on Amazon or go to Dr. Trasande's website, which is leotrasande.com. LeoTrasande.com. We'll put that up on the podcast along with the audio that we just created. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for being on the show with us today.
It was great being here. Thank you.
You're welcome. We'll be right back.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala.
News. I'm Chris Foster. 34 days into the partial government shutdown, this afternoon we'll have the first Senate votes on bills to end it. The Democrats' plan would end the shutdown for about 2 weeks of negotiations about border security. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
We can open up government and debate the issue of how we protect our borders. We all want to secure our borders. But as we protect our borders, we must protect our values as well as a nation.
Louisiana Republican Steve Scalise tells Fox.
There are a growing number of Democrats here in the House that are finally saying enough is enough. It's time for Nancy Pelosi to put something on the table, and they support the president's request for a wall.
And the Senate Republican plan does include border wall money. North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un, reports state media there, has ordered preparations for another meeting with